Works out as planned. The good doctor will be joining us live via Skype for a Q&A session coming up in just a moment as well. Now, my introduction for a live in the flesh human being for you here. Dr. Gregory Stanton is the president of Genocide Watch, and you can find it online at genocidewatch.net. He is the research professor in genocide studies and prevention at George Mason University in Fairfax County, Virginia, in the United States. He is best known for his work in the area of genocide studies. He's the founder and president of Genocide Watch, director of the Cambodian Genocide Project, and the founder and chair of the International Campaign to End Genocide. From 2007 to 2009, he was the president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. Please join me in a warm welcome, Dr. Gregory Stanton.
It is a really great pleasure for me to be with you again. I'll never forget when we were together just a couple of years ago. I asked the organizers to please turn on the lights in the room because I'm the kind of speaker that likes to look you straight in the eye. So with that in mind, I'd like to discuss with you some of the challenges that we face in the wake of what can only be called crimes against humanity, and indeed, I believe, genocide against the Rohingya and other Muslims, and for that matter, other groups, the Karen, the Shin, Kachin, in Myanmar today. But let's focus first on the Rohingya. The Rohingya aren't foreigners. They aren't foreigners in Myanmar. They've lived there for centuries. And the thought that this government can deny them citizenship is a bit like telling me, whose ancestors only landed in Connecticut in 1620, that I'm not a citizen of the United States. In fact, it's telling me that I better go back to England immediately. This violation of fundamental human rights, this denial of citizenship, is at the very heart of the violation of human rights of the Rohingya. Without citizenship, no human being can enjoy the basic rights that are guaranteed to every person under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the very first demand that we, as the American government, and for that matter as the whole world, must make of the government of Myanmar is that the government, that the legislature in Myanmar grant full citizenship and full rights to the Rohingya people and all other peoples who are living within the territory of Myanmar. Now. It has to be done now. Myanmar has over 135 legally recognized ethnic minority groups that are given citizenship, but not the Rohingya. The government considers the Rohingya as, quote, illegal immigrants from Bangladesh. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the people here in the United States, what I call the nativists, usually very white people who probably whose ancestors came here just 100 years ago or so, who are very upset about the so-called, quote, illegal aliens who are coming into the United States. When I meet one of these people, I always ask them, well, what planet do you think these people are coming from? Because actually, in some ways, I will remind you, as an honest American historian, we took over most of the western United States from Mexico. And in fact, a lot of the Mexicans who are coming to this country are in fact coming home. They're not really illegal aliens at all. In fact, another thing I would remind you about in this country's history is that our own country was a country built on an ideology of genocide. Our own was built on an ideology of manifest destiny, which believed that white people from Europe had a right to drive out and kill the Native Americans who already lived in this country, and not only that, to bring African slaves from Africa, more than 1/3 of whom died during the voyage from Africa to the United States. We are not a country that should be claiming that we are pure or that we are virtuous. We have that sin in our own past. We should never forget it whenever we're talking about this problem of genocide. The problem, of course, also with the Rohingya is that if they're not citizens of Myanmar, then where are they citizens? Well, the government of Myanmar says they're citizens of Bangladesh, but Bangladesh does not recognize the Rohingya as citizens. And not only that, it refuses to recognize them as refugees. So the Rohingya of Myanmar have become effectively stateless persons, denied this very basic right of every human being to citizenship. We've just heard in the current census, the Myanmar government does not even allow Rohingya to register as Rohingya. They have to say other. I have an actual story about that, of course, because when I used to have to cross the border from Swaziland into South Africa, when South Africa was still under apartheid, they had a form that you had to fill out, and they gave you choices of what your race was. They asked you for your race. And of course, one of the choices was white, another was, African, another one was Asian, so forth and so on. And by the way, this country still does it. Just try taking the U.S. Census. They make you choose what race you are part of. I think this should be abolished by the Supreme Court, but I don't think this court's about to do it. Well, every time I got to that question on the South African immigration forms, it did have a place for other. And so I would just write human. I was rather part of the human race. And of course the border guards would just cross that out and write, white. And I said, actually, if you take a look at my skin, it's not very white. It's more like pink or something. And, and then they'd cross it out and say Caucasian, and then I say, no, I'm not from the Caucasus, I promise. The truth is there's only one race, the human race. It is that fundamental truth that is the core of the anti-genocide movement, and it is what we must never forget. Genocide Watch has analyzed the whole genocidal process into 10 stages, and so I'd like to go through just how the Myanmar government has, in fact, progressed in its implementation of every single one of these 10 stages, and why we have concluded that, in fact, genocide is, in fact, going on in Myanmar. Now, many people say, well, it's not really quite genocide yet, it's just crimes against humanity. I would always remind such people that, in fact, genocide is a crime against humanity. But we don't get into these legal debates, I can tell you, at Genocide Watch. We just think it's a waste of time. I remember when they wasted 3 months trying to decide whether Darfur was a genocide or not. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of people were being slaughtered. We don't get into these debates, but let me just describe to you the basic process of genocide. The first is classification. Now, what the Myanmar government has done by refusing to grant identification cards to Rohingya, in fact, taking away their basic their identity cards and giving them these white cards that we just heard about, is they have refused to classify them as even members of the Myanmar nationality. So there you have a classification, a denial of classification, very similar to Hitler's denial of the Jewish citizenship in Germany in the 1935 Nuremberg laws. In fact, the similarities to Nazism that are being carried out in Myanmar right now are chilling. And I'll tell you about several others as we go along. The second stage, of course, in genocide is symbolization. Now, these ID cards are one of the main ways in which symbolization is carried out. You may remember during the Rwandan genocide, on your ID card it said whether you were a Tutsi or a Hutu or a Twa, and they used those ID cards to select people who were Tutsis to slaughter. Well, the Burmese regime refuses to even issue ID cards to Rohingya. And those ID cards are necessary to be able to travel, to obtain passports, to enroll in education. And so it's a perfect way of denying all rights to these people. The next stage after classification and symbolization is discrimination. And that is total in Myanmar against the Rohingya. They're denied land and property rights and ownership. In fact, in Myanmar, which essentially was a communist state until very recently, all property is still owned by the government. The land on which the Rohingya live can be taken away at any time, and in fact has been. And the Rohingya people are also barred from any government employment. The stage after discrimination in the genocidal process is what I call dehumanization. Perhaps the most egregious form of that is one which we heard about in one of the testimonies that we've seen here on the screen today, in which marriage restrictions, one of the basic rights of all people to be married to the person that they love, or the person to whom they need to be married, are taken away from them. In this case, in order to get an official marriage license, you have to bribe a government official. Sometimes it's $100, maybe it's $750. If you do get married, you're forced to not have more than 2 children. I would point out to you that under the Genocide Convention, the forced abortion of children of a group is an act of genocide. Full stop. You can take them to court on that one alone. This official government policy is also enforced through pregnancy tests before even issuing marriage licenses. And get this, this is to me, it's almost impossible for me to even conceive. Nursing mothers among the Rohingya are actually forced to do the nursing of their babies in front of Burmese soldiers. How much more dehumanizing can you get? And it's to ensure that the nursing mothers are not nursing more than 1 baby or 2 babies at a time. Or, they can't have 3. The fourth stage of genocide is organization. Well, that's very highly organized now, of course, as you saw. The Myanmar authorities have forced the Rohingya to live in essentially concentration camps. And in fact, those concentration camps, and you saw them marching to these concentration camps, those movies of the people marching to the concentration camps remind me so much of Jews marching to the ghettos under Hitler's Europe that I tell you, it sends chills down my spine. And we saw just what a small area of Sittwe now all of the Rohingya are now forced to live in. That's a ghetto. The next stage is polarization. It's where the victim group is polarized completely from the perpetrator group, from the dominant group. And of course, here we have it. It's very obvious. The Rohingya are simply not allowed to be part of Myanmar society. The stage after polarization is preparation, in which we saw already that these were government policies. They were actually through government orders that these policies came about. This is not accidental. It's not something that's simply a matter of local authorities using their will. These are official government documents that ordered these things. In other words, we have planning, we have preparation for this sort of crime against humanity and genocide. And then, finally, the stage before the actual genocide is persecution. As one of the UN Human Rights Commissioners said, the IDP camps are scenes of some of the greatest persecution in the world today. In fact, he said, I believe, that it was the greatest persecution he'd ever seen in an IDP camp. Basic public services such as health and education are completely ignored and neglected. The only medical care that was formerly provided by Doctors Without Borders is now prohibited because Doctors Without Borders has been expelled from Myanmar. And any NGOs allowed to come back in, as we now heard, are only allowed to do what they are supposed to do under the supervision of Burmese authorities. Illiteracy is over 80% because Rohingya children are not allowed to attend Burmese schools. And the Rohingya are not allowed to even organize their own schools. More than 40,000 Rohingya children are deprived of rights to travel to attend school or to marry in the future because their parents had an unauthorized marriage or exceeded the two-child limit that the Myanmar government has imposed on the Rohingya. And these blacklisted children are refused birth registration and so are not included in family lists and must actually be hidden. You got to hide them when the Burmese authorities go around and check your household, which they do regularly. Can you imagine having to hide your own children? We heard also that the military is now using rape as a weapon of persecution and as a means of access to food and other basic human rights. There has been a systematic burning of Muslim mosques. The Rohingya are subject to curfews and other restrictions on nearly all of their basic civil rights. In fact, Myanmar is one of the few nation states in the world that has never signed or ratified the International Covenant on Political and Civil Rights. There are only a few countries. But actually, you know what? That doesn't matter because the International Court of Justice has held that the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights has become customary international law. It applies to all countries, whether or not they've signed. So the Rohingya have been dehumanized and persecuted for centuries, and especially in the last few years. We finally get to the actual subject of genocide. Genocidal massacres, extermination. Now, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has denounced these crimes against the Rohingya in possibly the strongest terms ever sent to the UN Security Council. And this past week, the UN Special Rapporteur on Internally Displaced Persons stated that the Rohingya are the most persecuted displaced persons in the world. That is quite a distinction. The most persecuted displaced persons in the world. Many Rohingya, of course, attempt to flee to Bangladesh or Malaysia in rickety boats. But even there, they're not accorded the rights of refugees, and for instance, the Bangladesh authorities try to turn them back. many of these people, these boat people, drown. These violations of Rohingya rights are crimes against humanity under international law. There is no question at all about it. Burma or Myanmar should be taken to the International Criminal Court. Among the crimes against humanity that the Myanmar military regime is committing against the Rohingya are denial of citizenship, imprisonment in displaced persons camps, murder, mass rape, forced labor, denial of the right to travel, denial of educational rights for children, and denial of food and medicines. Tens of thousands of Rohingya have died because of this intentional destruction by the Myanmar state and Buddhist militias. Attacks against Muslims have spread to other areas of Myanmar as well. Burmese mass media have incited discrimination and dehumanization against the Rohingya and Muslims using the false threat of a population explosion among Muslims in Myanmar. In fact, the rate of population growth among Rohingya and Muslims in Myanmar is less than the rate of growth of the general population of Myanmar. That's been verified by demographers from a number of universities in the world. Violence against Muslims is not just targeted against the Rohingya. Muslims living in other parts of Myanmar have also been targets, and the Burmese government has also committed atrocities throughout Myanmar against other groups, such as the Shin, the Kachin, the Karen, and a number of other minority groups. This is genocide. This is genocide. Let no doubt be expressed about it. The world wavered on Darfur, trying to decide whether it was a genocide or not. We should not waver on what the Myanmar government is doing to the Rohingya and other minorities in Myanmar today. It is genocide. In 2013, President Thein Sein publicly declared that he would begin using force to stop religious conflict. And this was the president's first public comment on the issue. But right after that, 40 Muslims were killed during rioting in central Myanmar, and about 12,000 more Muslims were forced out of their homes and into refugee shelters. This very same initiative produced the release from house arrest of Aung San Suu Kyi and the lifting of restrictions on trade with Western countries have given much of the world press a false sense that the Myanmar regime is liberalizing. Well, in fact, the model that the Myanmar regime is following is China's, in which the liberalization is accompanied by firm control by the military and by the Communist Party in China's case, and in which minority groups in China, for example, are still being targeted. The Tibetans, the Uyghurs, many other groups. Well, that's what's also happening in Myanmar. In March 2013, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, Tomas Ojea Quintana, and you heard his statement in person, issued a statement in which he not only expressed the UN's concern about the violence between Muslims and Buddhists in Myanmar, but urged the government to take bold steps to rectify the ongoing violence. He noted that violence has been occurring since June of that year, and the government's been doing nothing to stop it. State-supported violence against Muslims not only continues a long pattern of discrimination, but is also a warning sign that this same regime is also committing genocidal violence against other groups. And the final stage of genocide is denial. Perhaps the most shameful indifference to the persecution and genocide of the Rohingya have been the justifications for Burmese government policies by the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, Aung San Suu Kyi. She has completely ignored her obligation as the holder of the world's highest honor for human rights, an honor she richly deserved when she received it. But she has now devalued that honor by not saying a word about the Myanmar government's persecution and genocide of the Rohingya and other minority groups in Myanmar. She'd obviously rather run for president of Myanmar in the next elections than speak out for human rights. I state this very boldly and very simply. Aung San Suu Kyi should surrender her Nobel Peace Prize. She has completely failed to live up to the obligation it imposes on her. So what must be done? Myanmar should immediately stop its human rights violations against the Rohingya, other Muslims, and other minority groups. The Myanmar Parliament should pass legislation that grants full citizenship to the Rohingya with all rights of citizens of Myanmar. Bangladesh should adhere to its obligations under the UN Convention on the Protection of Refugees by accepting Rohingya refugees and permit them to settle in refugee camps until they can be repatriated with full citizenship rights in Myanmar. And Western countries, including the United States, should revoke their new policy of collaboration with the Myanmar regime, and President Barack Obama, who I would remind you is another Nobel Peace Prize winner, should directly denounce the persecution and genocide of the Rohingya and other Muslims, the Shin, Karen, and other minority groups in Myanmar. In the coming election in the United States, we should demand of all candidates in the next election to directly address and denounce the persecution and genocide of the Rohingya, other Muslims, the Karen, the Shin, the Shan, and other minorities in Myanmar. It should be brought up at every single open forum that those candidates have to address. There should be somebody planted in every single one of those town meetings to ask that question. And we should remember that there is no statute of limitations for prosecutions of genocide and crimes against humanity. The perpetrators of these crimes will one day be tried for their crimes. I can tell you that from experience, because I founded the Cambodian Genocide Project in 1981 with the objective of bringing the Khmer Rouge to justice. And I immediately got a call from the Cambodian mission to the United Nations, from Thun Sen Prasit himself, who was a Khmer Rouge, telling me that if I, in fact, went forward with this project to document the crimes of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, which they no longer controlled, so we could actually go about the documentation, that I would be killed. Well, I simply answered him, "We'll get you first." And we did. They are on trial now for the crimes they committed in Cambodia, and they haven't got me yet. Confronted with this kind of suffering, we mustn't lose hope, because the suffering is so enormous. Buddhists actually do have a way of thinking about suffering that's very helpful here. They think that suffering is normal in life. And actually, so do Muslims and Christians and Jews. Suffering is part of what we have to live with in life. But I'm reminded of the words in Romans 5 about suffering, in which the Apostle Paul says, amazingly, we should rejoice in our suffering. Who on earth would rejoice in their suffering? But his answer is, because suffering builds endurance, and endurance creates character, and character gives us hope. We must never lose hope, because we will win.